So hello and welcome to this talk on wildflowers in sand dunes. I'm Emma from Dynamic Dunescapes. Dynamic Dunescapes is a partnership project if you haven't heard of it. The partners are Natural England, National Trust, the Wildlife Trusts, Plant Life and Natural Resources Wales, and we're funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the EU Life programme. And what we're doing is working hard to try and restore 7,000 hectares of coastal sand dune in the UK, because we've lost more than a third of our coastal sand dune habitat here in the last 120 years. And actually sand dunes are listed as the most threatened habitat type in Europe for biodiversity loss. We're running this series of online events to celebrate World Sand Dune Day, which is a new day, but a day designed to shine a spotlight on our vital sand dune habitats, the creatures that live in them, and we're designed to celebrate them with the communities that love them. So today's speaker, I'm delighted to say, is my friend Leif Bersweden. Leif is a botanist who's recently received his Ph.D. Of all of the things to achieve this year, he's also about to publish his second book. First book was The Orchid Hunter, second book, Where the Wildflowers Grow, and he's a wonderful science communicator and speaker too. So I've strong-armed him into coming back for a second year to talk to you all about plants. So Leif, wildflowers on sand dunes, over to you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's so kind. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for giving up what I'm sure is a very sunny evening with you as well. I appreciate you all being here. I will just do the classic thing at the beginning of a talk where I'm like, oh, I can share my screen, and I can never work out how to do it, even after 2 years. Here we go. Nice. Okay, we're on. Yes, so I am basically going to spend the next 45 minutes being very enthusiastic about sand dunes and their wildflowers. I'm a botanist, as Emma mentioned. I've spent a fair bit of time in sand dunes, not for work or anything, just wandering around and taking photos of the amazing plants and seeing what they do. They have some amazing adaptations, do some brilliant things, and I'm going to share some of those with you this evening. So I'm going to start by showing you this very beautiful drawing that I did. I promise you it's not done by a 5-year-old, even though that's what it looks like. I have basically, what I want to do this evening is take you through the different stages of a sand dune, from sort of start to finish, and I'll bring those up in a sec. But basically, to start with, sand dunes are basically this very hostile place to grow if you're a plant. We have these wonderful memories. The coast generally brings up these wonderful memories of seaside holidays and lovely memories of like walking along the beach and everything. But for a plant, the coast, and in particular sand dunes, is one of the most hostile places to live in the country, one of the harshest environments you could possibly imagine. And they're these incredibly dehydrating, salty environments. It's amazing actually that plants grow there at all, really. But there are a whole host of species, very specialized plants that thrive in these environments. Now, sand dunes are built by the wind, and they are held together by plants. So it's literally an environment that's it's basically built by an interaction between wind and plants. So in very simple terms, the wind blows sand, the sand gets caught by plants, and the plants hold it together and they build up into these sand dunes. I'm not a geographer by any means, so I'm going to keep this very simple from a geography point of view. But yeah, they have these various environments. So working from the sea inland, you start with the Strand line, which is where the sand dune begins to grow. You've then got the dunes themselves, which tend to be really dry and very exposed to the wind. You've then got these dune slacks, which are freshwater sort of pools or slightly salty pools of water that grow in the depressions. Then at the back of the dune, you have this sandy grassland that develops when the plants really start holding the sand together and when they die and decompose, they then add nutrients to the soil, and you start getting this sandy soil building up. And that's when you get these floriferous dune grasslands at the back of the dune. And then eventually you get scrub behind that as well. I'm not going to talk too much about scrub today, but I will mention all the other ones. So starting on the Strand line, this is where the dune begins its life. Now the Strand line is, again, is one of the most hostile environments you could possibly imagine. There's basically no fresh water, so it's kind of like a desert. There is an enormous amount of salt, both from the air and also from the sea. Obviously, during the day, most days of the year, the tide will come in, hit the Strand line, so you'll get seawater coming in, which is very toxic to most plants. There's wind as well, it's very exposed. And so it's this really, really difficult place to grow. But despite all of those challenges, you know, we wouldn't last a day sitting, getting in all that, with sand being blown at us and the sea washing over and wetting and drying with all that salt. But plants still live there. And there are this collection of species which are called pioneers, and they will establish themselves along the Strand line. Plants like sea rockets, which is really common all around the coast. It's a member of the cabbage family on the left here, with these cross-shaped, four-petaled lilac flowers. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Then you've got sea sandwort in the middle there, with these 5-petaled white flowers. And they form these sort of stacks of sort of very geometrically pleasing stacks of green leaves. And they can be identified throughout the year just because they're quite distinct with those stacks of leaves. And they flower kind of like May, June time. And then on the right there, one of the real ultimate survivors, prickly saltwort. And as you can see in that photo, it's literally growing out of the sand. This was just in the middle of the beach. And they have these little spines on them to protect against predation and being eaten by herbivores. And yeah, it's just kind of insane that these plants can live right on the edge. They are the last flowering plants you'll see before you get to the sea. And they are really, really clinging on. Now, what they do is so before you've got a dune at all, these plants will establish themselves along the Strand line where there's dead seaweed and things. And over time, the wind will start blowing sand, and the sand will start collecting within this vegetation. If the plants can hold that sand together for long enough, then a young dune will begin to grow. You'll start getting like a hummock of sand, which will grow into a little hillock, and so you get bigger and bigger until you get a sand dune. So these plants are crucial for building this amazing sand dune environment that we have. So just to give you a little more detail on one or two of them, sea rocket is the real sort of ruler of this particular habitat. It also goes on shingle, which is, you can see in the background of this photo, but they just love this strand line. And basically it is the last plant you'll find before you get to the sea. It's perhaps surprising. It can be relatively big, up to 0.5 meter tall, and they produce these big clumps of like rubbery leaves. They're like fleshy, full of water. So they produce this. They can't take much water out of the sand. Obviously, when it rains, they get a little bit of water, but otherwise, any water that's on the beach on the strand line is really, really salty. But the little that they do take up, they can store really, really well. So when you, if you ever see it, if you try just running your hand through a bank of sea rocket, and it feels amazing. It is literally like rubber. And there is absolutely no water escaping from those leaves. It's all stored in there. And they can survive for a long, long time without taking up any water. But the really cool thing that they do is you'll often see this along the top of the beach just before you get to the dunes. And it's kind of this like line of sea rocket plants growing in front of the dunes. And for years, I was like, what's going on here? It seems bizarre that they form this line. But actually what they're doing, I found out last year, is they're feeding on decaying seaweed of like the former strand line. So obviously as these plants establish along the strand line and start collecting sand that gets blown by the wind, eventually that strand line, all the decaying seaweed will get covered up. And so, what these plants are doing is they're feeding on that dead seaweed that's underneath the sand. And so they are the reincarnation of that former strand line. So it's really, really cool to see that these plants just, thriving on that dead seaweed. So that's a really cool one to start with. You then move into the dunes themselves. So once those pioneer species have built the young dunes, then sand starts collecting, and you start getting a few different species coming in. So over time, biodiversity will increase as more habitat becomes available. So sea holly, which I'll again mention in a minute, but it's a beautiful, beautiful sort of silvery blue plant, about the size of a football, which grows just in from the sea rocket, so at the very beginning of the dune. Again, can get quite big. I put up to 60 centimeters there because that's what the book says. I've never seen it that tall. I've usually seen it sort of 20 to 30 centimeters tall, but a very, very beautiful dune plant. And I will come back to that in a second. Dune pansy, which is this beautiful flower, which looks just like the pansies you might have in your garden or that hang from those hanging baskets outside pubs. But this is, a wild pansy which grows in the dunes. It's a specific subspecies of our wild pansy that's adapted to life in sand. And again, just really, really good at thriving in that environment. It's an annual plant, so they need that disturbance that the dynamic dune offers. And then the key species at this stage is the marram grass. Now, marram is the plant which is the real builder of the dunes. It can grow up to 1 meter tall, flowers July, August, but actually it's visible all year round as the main grass which fills up the sand dune. Many of you may have heard of it through school. It's one of the very few plants British plants which gets mentioned in secondary school textbooks. It's used as the example of a xerophyte, which is a plant that grows in environments that have very little liquid water available. And it has various different adaptations to the sand dune environment. So the leaves are, rather than being flat like a normal grass leaf, they curve them into cylinders because a leaf naturally loses water through the underside. And so by curling them into a cylinder, they trap all the water vapor that's released from the bottom of the leaf, trap it inside that cylinder, and then they can kind of recycle it. And then there are all sorts of structures sort of on a microscopic scale on the underside of that leaf, again, to trap water vapor and keep the plant as moist as possible. And if you go to a sand dune, you can actually unroll, it seems a bit mean, but you can unroll the marram leaves, and you can often see water droplets where the water condenses again on the inside of that leaf. They also have very deep roots, so they have sort of very kind of like this mesh of roots, which again, they sort of bind the dune together by creating this sort of almost like lattice structure which traps all the sand. And marram actually gets what's the word? It's like spurred on. So they're these dune builders, but they're so good at building dunes because they're spurred on by being covered in sand. So when they get a load of sand dumped all over them, that actually encourages growth. And so they'll pop up again, trap more sand, pop up again, and so they build dunes quite quickly. Over time, marram has been used for all sorts of different things because it's so tough, particularly on places like Anglesey in Wales. It's been used for things like thatching and shoes and fishing nets, and basically anything that required some kind of resistance to desiccation from the wind and the sand that's being blown around by the wind. They would use marram. And yeah, so it's this brilliant resource which people have used for a long period of time. I have one small anecdote about marram grass. Last year I was in a sand dune in Wales, just south of Anglesey, and was busy. It was a huge sand dune. I'd spent ages wandering around, finding all sorts of cool things. I was very lost, but it didn't matter because I was having an amazing time. And I was busy looking at marram, taking photos, trying to get photos of these cool structures that mean it's really good at retaining water. And when I suddenly became aware that I wasn't on my own anymore, and I turned around and there were two people there completely naked. And I was suddenly very aware of the fact that I was crouched, lurking in the dunes with my camera as a lone man all by myself. And yeah, suddenly realized that there was a naturist beach running along the side of this sand dune. And of course, my excuse that I was looking for plants wasn't exactly, you know, obviously it was completely true. I was looking for plants, but they were convinced that I was trying to sneak photos of them. And so in trying to explain this, I panicked and began reeling off all the adaptations that marram has to surviving in a sand dune environment, to this bemused couple who had no idea why I was suddenly listing all these weird things about this grass. But yes, I panicked and told them all about it. When I ran out of things to say, they were very nice and said, yeah, have a nice day, turned around and went off again once they decided that I wasn't there trying to take photos of them. But yeah, so make sure when you do go to a sand dune, just make sure do a double check and make sure you're aware of any naturist beaches around. Yes, that's marram. So there are other really cool things in the sort of the sandy bit of the dune. So down the marram dominates these environments, but actually when you look at the ground flora on the surface of the sand, you get things like hare's foot clover, which is this wonderful, wonderful thing that has these really soft, fluffy flower heads, which give it the name hare's foot clover because it's like a hare's paw. And they love this low nutrient environment. They can withstand the dry, sand, salty conditions, but they thrive in this environment because they are annual plants, so they need a bit of disturbance, which the sand dune, being a very dynamic, shifting environment, creates that habitat for them. And so they've got lots of opportunities to deposit their seeds into this, well, I was going to say the soil, but it's kind of like the sandy soil. But the really cool thing they do, as with all members of the pea family, is they form this relationship with bacteria in order to basically manufacture their own fertilizer. So plants need various things to grow, and one of the key things is nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is very abundant in the air that we breathe, but it is in the form in the air that it is, plants find it very difficult to take that up. And so what's available to them in the soil is there's a little bit of stuff that they can take up, but it's generally quite hard for them to find available nitrogen. So what hare's foot clover and other members of the pea family have done to survive in these or to thrive in these low nutrient environments is they've teamed up with these bacteria, and the bacteria are really good at converting the nitrogen in the air into a form of nitrogen that the plant can take up, which is called ammonia. So the bacteria take the nitrogen in the air, turn it into ammonia, feed it to the plant, and they live in little sort of nodules on the roots. And in return, the plant photosynthesizes, produces sugars, which it then feeds and exchanges with the bacteria for that ammonia. So they team up and they form this sort of working relationship. Both of them benefit, and yeah, the clovers thrive because they've got a little bit of fertilizer to keep them going in the poor sands of the dune. Then sea holly, again, completely different adaptations to growing in this environment. So sea holly has these really, really tough leaves that are very spiky and look a bit like holly leaves, though the two plants are unrelated. They have these deep tap roots, which go down 1 or 2 meters into the soil to reach the water table. The tap roots were actually once eaten. They were sort of candied and eaten as like a sweet snack back in the 17th and 18th centuries. Particularly in Colchester and Essex, this was a real tradition. Yeah, where it was once so common that they used to dig up these tap roots and provided them with a sweet treat. But they have these really tough leaves. They feel a bit like plastic. As you can see here in this image, the water literally beads off them. This is one I found the other day, and I mean, it's beautiful. That I just love that image where you can see through the water droplet, all the veins on the leaf. But how perfect the water droplet is, it's not spreading out at all, because the leaf is just so good at stopping water escaping and therefore stopping it getting in that way as well. So yeah, having this tough layer means that, yeah, no water's getting in or out through the leaves, all coming through that deep taproot. And they're really spiky. And so they form these sort of very, very well protected little bobbly patches on beaches, in dunes. This is presumably an adaptation to herbivores when there used to be wild animals roaming along the beaches. Nothing would want to eat that. You know, I tried touching it and it's very spiky. So yeah, definitely wouldn't want to try munching that. But yeah, again, just supremely adapted to living in this incredibly hostile environment. So the dune slacks. So we've had the Strand line, which then builds up into the sand dunes, and over time, as the wind is moving these environments around and constantly shifting them and changing them, you get these structures, for want of a better word, called dune slacks forming, where wind scoops out sand from the middle of the dune and sort of wears it down to the point where it reaches the water table. So this is in from the sea, usually, it drops fairly low down. And depending on how low the water table is, you can get down to this point where you just get these sort of freshwater pools forming. And these are amazing environments, and they are by far and away the most species-rich part of the sand dune. If you joined the talk yesterday, which Emma tells me was about natterjack toads, you'll probably have heard all about these parts of the dune. This is where the natterjack toads will live, if you're lucky enough to find them. But they have just, oh my goodness, the most amazing plants in them. It is kind of the realm of various cool things. We've got grass of Parnassus on the left here, which are these beautiful sort of ghostly white cupped goblet flowers, which if you look inside, if you do find them, if you look inside, they have these extraordinary like honeycomb colored combs, which look very attractive, and they're supposedly meant to attract. No one actually knows what they're for, but the theory is they attract insects to the flower with the false promise of nectar. It's a weird name. It's not a grass. I don't think it's any longer found on Mount Parnassus in Greece, but it's got this bizarre name, grass of Parnassus. Doesn't really relate to the plant or anything like that, but it is quite nice. The main bit of the dune slack is often filled with two very common plants, lesser spearwort, which is this buttercup colored, well, yeah, it's like a dune buttercup, which is in the middle at the top there. This is like a damp-loving, water-loving buttercup, very, very common, and you're almost guaranteed to find that one. And then on the right here, you've got creeping willow, which often forms these carpets of silvery leaves, very, very low growing. It can grow up to sort of 1/2 meter tall, but it's usually about ankle height, and flowers in April or May, but then retains these beautiful silvery leaves long into the season. Now, what that plant does is provide a brilliant habitat for an orchid species. Now, dune slacks are kind of the place to go looking for orchids if you're in a sand dune. There are loads of different species which like growing there. Early marsh orchids grow there. Yeah, well, lots of different marsh orchid species will grow there. But the one which the creeping willow really encourages is this one, which is called a Coralroot Orchid. Now, Coralroot Orchid is small and green, and it is very exciting, I promise. But it comes in these two forms. We've got the dune form and the woodland form. Now, the woodland form tends to be in very shady, damp areas, so it's bright green, but the dune form grows out in the open, still in the damp in these dune slacks, but doesn't have the tree cover. And so they tend to be this reddish color, where they're producing a compound called anthocyanin, which is basically like melanin. So it's there to protect, it's like a sunscreen, it protects the DNA of the plant from the sun's rays. So when they're in the woodland in the shade, they don't really need it. But as soon as you find them in the sand dunes, they go this bright red color. And orchids are really, really dependent for at least some of their lives on a fungal partner. So most plants will send their seeds off into the world with this sort of packed lunch of starch and sugar, so that when the seed lands in the soil, it has like a food store so that it can germinate, and it has the energy to push up through the soil until it can start producing leaves and start photosynthesizing itself. But orchids don't provide their seeds with a packed lunch. So they send their seeds off into the world with nothing. What this means is that the seeds can be very, very small. So they're literally like specks of dust, and they can travel long distances. And yeah, there are certain advantages, but basically what it means is that when the orchid seed lands in the soil, they need some way to stay alive before they can start photosynthesizing. So what they do is they make friends with a fungus. It's kind of like the first day at school. So they turn up and they sidle up to their fungus friend, and they're like, oh, hi, my mum didn't pack me lunch today. I was just wondering if maybe I could have a cheese string or something. And the fungus is like, oh yeah, and made a friend, no problem. And it shares its lunch. So they team up and they form this relationship where the fungus starts giving food to the orchid, and the orchid uses that food to germinate and push up through the soil. What this quickly turns into, though, is a bit of a sort of school bully situation. So the orchid, upon realizing that it can get this food for free, doesn't actually give anything back to the fungus. So it takes and takes and takes, doesn't give anything back. And it basically farms the fungus. So it lets it grow within its roots, and then occasionally it will just start digesting bits of the fungus. Different species will rely on this fungus for various lengths of time during their life. So at one extreme, you've got things like bird's nest orchids, which are completely reliant on the fungus for their whole life and just never produce any green leaves, don't do any photosynthesis, and just take all their nutrients from the fungus. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got orchids like creeping ladies' tresses, which grow in pine forests, and they wean themselves off almost completely from their fungal friend, or fungal servant rather, over the course of their life. Coralroot orchids are somewhere in the middle, but generally towards the bird's nest orchid end. So they, throughout their life, depend heavily on the fungal partner in the soil. They don't do much photosynthesis. They don't have proper leaves. They do have photosynthetic stems, so they do a little bit of photosynthesis through their stems. But yeah, largely they do depend on the fungus in the soil. Now, the creeping willow, which I mentioned before, is associated with the specific fungus that the Coralroot orchid makes friends with. So wherever wherever you find Coralroot orchids in sand dunes, you will also find creeping willow. They'll grow. So if you're looking for a Coralroot orchid in a sand dune, you will only search in the bits where there's creeping willow, because you won't really find it anywhere else. So yeah, they're very, very cool. Really, really classic. And not a common species to find in a sand dune, but a really, really nice one if you go to the right places. They aren't the only rare orchid which grows in dune slacks, though. There is an even rarer one called the Fen Orchid. And for this one, you'd actually have to go to a very specific site in South Wales called Kenfig. But they are an example of a plant that requires very specific conservation work in sand dunes. So they need bare ground, basically. As soon as you get plants growing up in a dune slack, they outcompete the fen orchids. Fen orchids disappear. And so they require the instability provided by this dynamic, shifting, moving environment that the dune gives them. But they do this weird thing where they rely on various different ways of getting pollinated. But one of the ways they ensure pollination is by depending on the rain. So you can see in this photo in the middle, there is, oh, I wonder if I can, is there a arrow? No, I can't do it. Anyway, basically, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but hopefully you can. This is the flower in the middle here. It's got these weird sort of petals sticking out here. And this one is a specialized petal called the lip. And it's sort of bent in such a way that when rain falls onto the top of it, the rain is deflected 90 degrees and comes into contact with the pollen, which is in the structure here in the middle called the column. And it splats into the pollen, splashes it everywhere, and it hits the female part of the flower, the stigma, and sort of self-pollinates the orchid. So they do depend a little bit on insect pollination to produce seeds, but this is another way, is by self-pollinating themselves using the rain. They also reproduce vegetatively, so you'll get these little things called pseudobulbs, which are like a growth at the bottom of the orchid spike, which are basically like little plants, just like clones that they sort of grow on the side. And when those clones get sort of mature enough, they'll just drop off into the sandy soil in the dune slack and form new plants. So yeah, that's just an example of a very rare plant that, you know, if you're out in the sand dune looking at plants and you happen to spot one of these, it's definitely worth recording because it's a very, very special plant. So the last habitat that I'm going to look at in the sand dune is then moving further back still, where there's been a bit of time, the dunes have been around for a bit of time, plants have lived there, they've died there, and when they've decomposed, they begin to add organic matter to the sand, and you end up with these sandy soils, which are very much stabilized by all the plants that are growing there and all their roots. And you get these very flowery and very colorful sandy grasslands that exist just behind the sand dunes. So in this environment, you get all sorts of incredible things. So I've just picked out three things here. So on the left, you've got early forget-me-nots, which are one of the tiniest flowers you'll ever see. Very, very small, very bright blue. You have to get really close down to have a look at them. And they do this amazing thing where they color code their flowers. So obviously, if you're a flower or if you're a plant, you want as many of your flowers to be pollinated as possible so that you can produce as many seeds as possible and as many offspring as possible. So what the forget-me-nots do is they color code their flowers to tell insects or pollinators which flowers have already been pollinated and which ones they want you to go to as a pollinator. So what they do, and bear in mind that insects see a different wavelength of light to us. So the classic forget-me-not flower is these 5 blue petals surrounding a yellow ring at the middle. Now to an insect, that yellow ring looks black. They see in UV light, and to them that ring looks black. And they learn that when the ring is black, there is nectar in that flower. So they visit those flowers. But what the forget-me-not does is as soon as the flower has been pollinated, that yellow ring at the center fades to white. And so what the insect sees is the black rings and white rings. once the flower has been pollinated, they stop producing nectar. And so the insects very quickly learn that the flowers with the black ring, or the yellow ring as we say it, they have nectar, and the forget-me-not flowers with the white ring don't have any nectar. So they selectively, and there's been a study on the alpine forget-me-not which shows this, they selectively go towards the flowers that have the nectar in, that are unpollinated. And so what this means is that it's this wonderful case of poetic serendipity, sort of like let no flower be forgotten. And it means that most forget-me-not flowers get pollinated. So they're really cool. They're an early species flowering April, May time. But yeah, they love these sandy grasslands and require getting down on your hands and knees if you can, because they have very, very tiny flowers. Then the next one I want to talk very briefly about is common rest harrow. These beautiful pink pea flowers. It's in the pea family. So again, it does this, it teams up with the bacteria, gets the nitrogen from the bacteria and gives the bacteria sugars from photosynthesis. This one really binds the ground together. It has these really tough roots, which are so tough that they used to be a real problem for farmers ploughing their fields, which is where the name rest harrow came from, because the farmers really struggled to get their ploughs through the roots of this plant. But yeah, they really love the sandy grassland as well. And then you have the broomrapes, common broomrape, which is a parasitic plant. So these things will grow in the short grassland in amongst the clovers and the medics and the trefoils. Basically any member of the pea family, they will grow right next to them because they parasitize them. So broomrapes are these incredible things which take the how to be a plant rulebook and they chuck it out the window. So they, as you can see, they are not green. I think one of the first things, when you hear the word plant, one of the first things you end up thinking is green. It's just so ingrained in us. But these plants never produce any green. They don't produce proper leaves. They don't even produce proper roots either. So they really are completely bizarre. And yes, they parasitize members of the pea family. And so what they do is the seed is sort of lying dormant in the soil, just waiting and kind of basically like sniffing the chemicals in the soil. And as soon as they sniff out the chemicals released by the roots of a suitable host plant, they produce this kind of root-like structure which wiggles through the soil, following this sort of trail of sort of scent breadcrumbs through the soil, and finds the roots of the host plant. They plug into it, and then they begin siphoning off literally everything they need to grow. So they take water that the pea plant has taken from the soil. They take nutrients that it's taken from the soil, and they take sugars, which it's produced by photosynthesis. And then they use all that to produce these spikes of flowers, which look dead, but actually these are completely in their prime. And then insects will come along, pollinate them, and yeah, then they produce seeds to produce their next generation of plants. So it's this amazing thing, which just, completely challenges our definitions of a plant. Not green at all, and I just love them. They're really, really cool. So they will grow in that sandy grassland, parasitizing all the pea plants that grow there too. So just to finish then, sand dunes are obviously these incredibly dynamic environments. They are constantly shifting and changing as the wind blows sand around and digs out these dune slacks and builds new dunes on the strand line. And over time you get the build-up of the dunes, all thanks to these plants. So the pioneer species are the ones which start everything off, start the dune building, feeding on that seaweed on the strand line. You then get the marram grass, which then begins to really go for it and bind the dunes together. And as I said, they just accelerate their growth every time they get buried in sand. So they start building the big dune hummocks. The wind then carves out these dune slacks, which are full of these unusual species, adding real diversity to the sand dune environment. And then you get the stabilization of that sandy grassland. And so over time, you start on the strand line with nothing, but then the plants build this environment, which is so cool. And there are so many specialized things which don't grow anywhere else, that can just be found in this environment. And so, yeah, you can see that over time, you get this succession of different habitats all the way up to that grassland. So yeah, they're very important habitats. They host all these incredible plants, very, very specialized things, but they're also really important for us and for our livelihoods as well. So with climate change, obviously sea levels are rising, storms are becoming more frequent, and all these plants forming this environment, protect against the storm surges and coastal flooding. They act as this kind of natural barrier to all of that, and their flora, as I've said so many times, is just, I find it incredibly inspiring. You go to these places, and I try to put myself in the shoes of these plants. I try to imagine what it's like to live in an environment where there's basically no fresh water. It's very salty, it's very dry, constantly having sand pelted at you by the wind. And I find it so inspiring that not only can anything grow there, but there are so many species adapted in all sorts of wonderful ways to this dune environment. So yeah, they're very cool. I think you should all go and look for dune wildflowers next time you're in a sand dune. They really are wonderful and very, very unusual and relatively rare habitats in this country. So yeah, very deserving of being celebrated. So yeah, thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, then I'm very happy to answer them or try to answer them. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks very much, Leif. That was brilliant. I have to say, I think my favourite part was one of your top tips for public engagement, which is not to sneak up accidentally on naturists. Something I'll be keeping in mind next time. I'm going to Devon next week to one of our sand dune sites. It's going to be ever present in my mind. I'll tell you that right now. Thanks everyone. You are very welcome to pop some questions in the chat. The first one we've got is what do you think, what would your advice be on the best kind of dune plant ID guides to start out with if somebody wanted to, you've inspired someone's botany journey in our coastal ecosystems? Is there anywhere that you can point people to other than Dynamic Dunescapes, of course?
I took the answer right out of my mouth, Emma. That's a very good question. To be honest, I'm not aware of any sand dune specific identification guides. That's not to say they don't exist. I suspect they probably do exist, because we know our flora very well, and there seem to be books on everything to do with our flora. So I suspect they do exist. I do know of one very short guide, which is not going to be very useful because it's specific to the Northumberland coast. And I've completely forgotten the name of it as well, so that's really unhelpful. But yeah, I'm afraid, I mean, I just use this book, but it's for all wildflowers in the country, but that obviously covers your sand dune plants as well. But yeah, I'm sure there will be guides. The BSBI website would be a good place to start looking, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. But yeah, I think also websites like the Wildlife Trust and Plant Life, I know, have sort of sand dune specific web pages, as I'm sure do Dynamic Dunescapes. So yeah, they certainly have pages on some of the commonest dune wildflowers to look out for.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, we do have a couple at Dynamic Dunescapes. We've produced some very small guides, but they're more for if you just want to get a little bit started, as opposed to anything super in depth. So I feel it's my duty to also point people to our website too. Great question coming in from Cameron, which is actually something that's crossed my mind before as well. What do you think about plant ID apps? How reliable are they? Because they're a great way for engaging the public in taking notice of the world around them and really thinking about the plants and trying to give them names and understanding a little bit more about them. But what's your experience with them? Do you use any, and do you think they're a useful tool?
So I don't use any. I have recently decided that I need to trial a few because I'm getting asked this question more and more. They are getting better very quickly. At the moment, I would say I'm better than an app, but I don't think it's going to be long before the apps start outperforming me.
So we're not going to see a Leaf app. That's not happening.
Well, yeah, I could. If I was any good at computers, I could try and make one myself. But yeah, so I think basically AI is getting to a point now where that it is getting better. And someone showed me, I think it's called Seek, which is part of the iNaturalist app, and they showed me that, and it was pretty accurate. There was one thing they showed me which I could identify, but the app couldn't. So I was like, ha. But yeah, it was pretty good. It was pretty good. And so they're getting very good. So yeah, from what I saw, the Seek, I think it was called Seek, the app. And it was part of iNaturalist. So the whole thing is very like, it's kind of like Pokemon, because you like take a photo of something, it brings up this thing that identifies it for you and says, you know, it grows in this habitat, it gets to this height, it flowers at this time of year, it gives you all the stats. And as someone who grew up loving Pokemon, that was very appealing. So yeah, I might get that and have a fiddle around with it. But yeah, I need to start properly doing it, because people are asking me more and more. So I need to be able to give advice. Something which I have just recalled though is, again, Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland have written an article about the different apps, and they've reviewed each one, or like each of the major ones. And so again, on their website is a good place to look to see the different ones of those.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll stick my flag on one of those apps you just mentioned, actually, iNaturalist. It's not the AI side of things where the computer identifies it for you, but you can, anyone anywhere in the world, upload observations of things that you've seen, and not just plants, animals are too. And it's more that the community can help you identify what you found, and then that data can also be used by scientists and researchers who are looking at certain species or certain areas as well. So I would say that iNaturalist is always on my phone when I'm out and about, and those of you listening or watching, you might find that useful too if you've not used iNaturalist before as well. Okay, and the next question, which leads on quite nicely, is where do you record your plant sightings? What plants are worth recording, and what info do you note down? And shall I make a horrible confession?
Yes, I think
I very recently was out in Dorset, and I was crouched down in the field, and I said, gosh, this looks very much like an orchid. Do you know what? I'm confident it's an orchid. I'm going to take a picture and I'm going to text my friend who knows a lot of things about orchids. That was you, and you got very excited and said, this is a very rare early spider orchid. I can't believe you found this orchid. Where are you? And I told you where I thought I was. And you said, they've never been recorded here before. You have to get yourself over to the British Society of Botany, BSBI. Have I got that right?
Yes,
British
Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland.
There we go, halfway there. And you said, listen, this is the place to record your sighting. This is incredibly important. And then when I looked on a map, I was in not the place that I thought I was. I was actually in the one place in Dorset where this orchid is very common. So I had to apologise to you, and we hadn't made an exciting discovery, but I had stumbled across an orchid, and I think you are part of the reason I knew what an orchid was at all. But so that's one of the places where you should go. Do you have any other places that people should be taking down their sightings, and what constitutes what makes a plant worth recording as part of their question as well? So
yeah, so the place to go is exactly where you went, Emma, to the SBI website homepage. They have a button that says record a plant, and they have this very short, very easy form to fill out. It requires a few details, like basically where, what is it, and your name. And then there are there's then optional details that you can add, like whether it's in flower, how many plants there are, all that kind of thing. So in its bare minimum form, it's very, very easy to do. The things to note are, so yeah, basically any plant is worth recording. The more data we have, the more information there is available to scientists doing work on different populations and that kind of thing. So some people will go out and they will record everything they find, which I realize is not everyone's cup of tea. I love doing that, but yeah, you don't get very far very quickly. in terms of like what's worth recording, if you're only going to do a few, I think, I suppose, yeah. I mean, if you're actually going out recording, then you might have a general idea of what's rarer and what's not. I find when I find a plant which is either generally quite unusual or growing in a habitat that I'm not used to seeing it in, then I will again go on the BSBI website, on their distribution maps page, just type in the name of the plants, go to where I am on the map and just see if it's been recorded or not. If it's, this happened to me yesterday. I found common meadow rue growing in London, and so I'm used to seeing it in water meadows, so I just had a quick look, and it hadn't been recorded there at all in this particular place I was in. So worth having a look. Obviously, it's a bit of an effort to do that for every single plant you find, but I would say in a sand dune, anything that isn't obviously everywhere is always worth recording, but it entirely depends how much time you want to spend on it, but it is very easy to do, and all via the BSBI website.
And I suppose actually, we should wrap up in a minute. I've got one more question to get to, but just on the note of recording thing in sand dunes, one of the things that our project particularly is looking at the movement and kind of overall spread of invasive species in the sand dunes. So if you're recording some of the things that you see, you can actually help us map where problem areas might be and where we can greater focus some of our conservation efforts. So that's a kind of a flip side, not just of you learning what's going on, but actually supporting research and hands-on land management. So that can be really useful.
That's a much better answer.
It came to me just at the end there. The last question before we go, I've got to shine the spotlight on something that's happening that's very exciting next week. You've got a new book out, Where the Wildflowers Grow. So thank you so much for taking some time in your hectic schedule of doing press and all sorts of exciting things this week in the lead up to that. Massive congratulations. But is there anything that you can tell us, if you've got any anecdotes or sneak peeks that can kind of whet the appetites of all of us who are looking forward to getting our hands on a copy soon?
Ooh, well, it's very kind of you to bring it up for me. Well, at this stage, this would be the perfect point to tell that sand dune naturist story, but I've already told you that, so that's in the book. You can read all about that in there. In terms of interesting anecdotes, I started the book so it's a journey through the calendar year, botanizing my way through the seasons, and kind of like shining a light on our plants, all the amazing things they do. So there's a whole chapter on beach botany and sand dunes and salt marshes. But yeah, so I worked my way through the seasons, through the different habitats, finding the common plants which sort of define those habitats that anyone can go out and find, as well as the more unusual things that do all these wacky, wonderful things that so few people hear about, because we tend to dismiss plants because they're boring, because they don't move, and we never hear these stories. So the whole book is trying to shine a light on that. I began the year on the 1st of January in London with my mum. I was very hungover, she wasn't, but it was raining and it was just grey and miserable, and we went out to look for the little street plants which grow in the pavements. And at the end of this, after actually my mum had gone home at this point, but I found a plant called shaggy soldier, which is this really cool thing. It looks like tiny daisy flower heads, and it was by far the most exciting thing I'd found all day, and it was growing out from the bottom of a lamppost outside a fairly plain building, which I didn't realize at the time, but it was the Ministry of Justice. And I was just like round the sides, and it was like a side entrance, but I was on the pavement, the plant was growing out of the bottom of this lamppost. I got very excited about it, so I like crouched down on the ground to have a look at this plant, and I suddenly heard behind me this guy like shouting at me, saying hello, hello, hello. So I turned around, and there was a security guard who who was like, what are you doing? Like, everyone inside has got you on the cameras, they're freaking out because they don't know what you're doing. And I'm just like crouched on the pavement outside the Ministry of Justice. I'm like, I'm just looking at this shaggy soldier. Do you want to see? And he was like, what are you doing? I was like, yeah, I'm just looking at this shaggy soldier. like, do you want to have a look? And he was so confused. So I was like, look, it's just this, it's a wildflower. It's growing out from the pavement. It's amazing because it's, you know, it's got basically nothing to grow on. It's just coming out of the pavement. How amazing is that? And he just didn't understand what I was doing. Had no idea. He was very confused. You know, there's this random guy in his mid-20s, doesn't look like a botanist by any means. He's, you know, it's the middle of winter in the middle of London. It's freezing cold. It's raining. It's the last time and place you could possibly imagine anyone to go looking for plants. But yeah, he didn't understand that he thought I was, I don't know what he thought I was doing, but it wasn't looking at plants. And eventually he turned me away. He said I was disturbing the peace, which I wasn't, because I was just hanging out with a plant. But yeah, he sent me away. So I was like, I didn't really want to get arrested on day one of this book. So although that would have actually made quite a fun story. But anyway, yeah,
fantastic.
So that is a completely random anecdote for you. It has nothing to do with sand dunes, but yeah.
But well worth it indeed. Imagine if you had ended up with that on your criminal record, bothering in the pursuit of a book.
Well, this is the thing.
There's a lot of crouching in your anecdotes. I think there's a lot of crouching in your life as a plant hunter.
Yeah, I do spend most of my time on the ground with my bum in the air. So yeah.
And that's how you identify a wild Leif.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Leif. We should probably wrap up now. It's been a good hour. So thank you so much for giving us your time. And sorry to all the questions we didn't quite get around to, but I do hope you've enjoyed this evening.